Greetings and welcome back to another episode of Well, Why Not? So obviously, just to address the elephant in the room before we get started, it's been a while since my previous episode. Although when I recorded that episode, I had fully intended to be more consistent with recording, but I would say pretty much the same reasons I gave in that episode about why I had to take a hiatus apply for this one as well. Just, life happening and giving myself grace and focusing on the different priorities as I needed to at the time. And of course, this is a priority for me. I'm always thinking about topics and things that I'd like to do, but I just can't do all of it at the same time. So I am happy to have somewhat of a reprieve now. I can't even say the summer. The summer's almost over, but I'm also not going to necessarily stick to the previous schedule that I had established, where I would record my last episode of the quote unquote season around June and then start recording again in the fall. So I will make the most of the time that I have available to me right now and get as many out there as possible. And I hope that you all can be patient with me and hang in there and just tune in when there's something to tune into. Okay, so today's episode, I would like to talk about the college application process, and specifically for the US. This is something that I know a lot of families worry about, especially when making the choice to move abroad. I think sometimes the assumption is, oh, well, if my child is in a foreign school or an international school, that's going to hurt his or her chances of going to the US for university if the child chooses to. I don't think that's the case, especially now. I think that more and more education systems are establishing more universal type programs to make it easier for kids to kind of move in and out of systems and not be bound by borders necessarily. I think the EU does a pretty good job of that already. Obviously, if you're part of the EU, you go to any school, from what I understand. It's easy for you to continue studying, even law. I remember that surprised me, and this was years ago, because I think this was early on. So that's how many years, probably over 20. The EU was kind of new, and just learning about the different advantages education-wise. So a German student could actually go and study law in France and then go back to Germany to practice, which is quite rare. I think, again, other systems, I know that the Nigerian legal system, or the law schools there, they facilitate students who study in the UK. And when they come back, they have to do like a year to just kind of catch up and make sure that they're very familiar with local laws. But again, those examples are few and far between. That said, there are programs like the International Baccalaureate, the IB program, which is really, I think it's probably the biggest program out there, that if you attend a school that is accredited and offers that program, you pretty much have thousands of universities that will recognize your grades and everything. And it eliminates a couple of steps that you would need to take if you are choosing a different type of program. So it really it's pretty intense from what I understand. It's very rigorous, and of course is heavy on English. But again, the idea is you have access to, a lot of different countries who with universities that will automatically recognize that as a not only a high school diploma, but a competitive one. That doesn't mean that you get to skip any of the, at least from what I know for the US, if you are applying with an IB, that doesn't mean you get to skip the SATs or any of the other testing requirements. But from what I understand, you don't have to take the TOEFL should your high school be in a different language, because they understand that, again, that program is heavily based on English. So you should automatically, if you've acquired that diploma, you should have a good level of English. Okay, so that said, I think I've mentioned in previous episodes, I made the choice to put my children in French school. And I think similar to the advantages of the IB, I knew that the French system, especially abroad, was standardized. So no matter how many times we had to move, whenever we had to move, it would be easy for them to continue their studies without a lot of adjustment. Well, aside from the social ones, but just academically, it would be the same thing, and it literally is. But that also comes with the added challenge of translating grades and taking the TOEFL, because both of my children are or wanted to study in the US. So my daughter just graduated university, and so I went through this whole process with her probably a little over 5 years ago. I feel like we started in 2019, and now my son is graduating next year, so we are currently in the process. So that's why I thought it's a timely episode, because this is all very fresh in my head, and things change, but not a whole lot. I just comparing the process from before, it's pretty much the same requirements. Because they're in a system that's preparing them mostly for the French university system, although the French bac is also recognized, obviously, by EU countries and some other countries as well as the US. It's just you have a couple more steps that you need to go through that you wouldn't have to go through with the IB. So before I mean, any parent or family that is asking about this process and whether it's easy or whether there are disadvantages, I think that's relative. I think it just depends on your perspective. Again, I made the choice for their primary, secondary education, just knowing that there was a likelihood we move unexpectedly. But if I also see families, especially families with like U.S. Embassy or international organizations that prefer American systems. Now, I will say the disadvantage, or the couple actually, but one, with the American international school systems, they're not standardized. So each school has some leeway in terms of what their program looks like. They are accredited, most of them by, I think it's, I'm thinking NACI, but I know NACI is for younger children. I think it's the SACS. I think it's the Southern Association of something anyway, but they are accredited. I mean, that's something to obviously make sure of when looking at primary and secondary schools. But again, they're should you want to move them schools, even within the same country, you'll see a huge difference between the programs, what they're learning, what books they're reading, how their preparation is done. The other disadvantage that I have seen, at least in Latin America, is the international American schools. Then these are the ones that are accredited. They are very expensive. So, and it just varies. It's really hard to understand why. One is much, I mean, in general, they usually all are, but sometimes there can be a huge variance even in those high costs. And again, I think it goes back to what requirements they have for their teachers, what kind of program they have, how big the school is. There's all of that to consider. So I can't say like there's a disadvantage. I can't say that there are additional obstacles, let's say, by having your children go to school or attend an international school that isn't U.S. accredited. There is just that there are additional steps, and yes, that can be challenging navigating those steps, especially if the school they attend doesn't support that process. I mean, I went to public school, and I remember, again, first generation immigrant. So if my school didn't have like the guidance counselors available to help me through the process, I would have been pretty lost. Granted, I had an older sibling who did it before me, but still, it was very helpful to have somebody within the school that was already looking out for me in that sense. I remember like sophomore year having those conversations and making sure that I was taking the right classes and all that. So there's that to consider. But again, I think going to an international school, it's not necessarily the same. Obviously, there are requirements, and in terms of making sure that the program that you're in qualifies. I have not yet seen where like a university will say, oh, if you went to this and this school in Ecuador or in Peru, your diploma doesn't count. I think the way that they try to level the field, and I think that's across the board in the U.S., regardless of it being international or not, is through like SATs. So they look at that in addition to the grades that you've received. And of course, like if you're trying to get into a science program or any STEM program, they are going to make sure, or at least look at, depending on the university, that you've taken those types of courses during your high school career as well. But other than that, again, it's just knowing that you have those steps that you have to take that you wouldn't necessarily have to take if you were in a U.S. accredited school, or if you stayed in the U.S. to begin with. So it's important to do your research. I think that's the first thing. Again, because the schools vary. The French system is pretty hard to get into depending on the country, the school, but even though they are standard, I think in terms of how they enroll children, that can vary. I've seen that. I could say that the French school here has changed a lot from what I understand. Historically, they were very strict. So either your parents had to be Francophone, or you had to have a family member that also attended the school, which I think would also kind of lend to at least somebody in your family is Francophone. Supposedly, it was done just to kind of support the child's language development. I think obviously it has more to it. There's some classism in there, and making sure certain people didn't have access. But I do see, and I have seen over the past few years, a huge effort to open the doors a lot more. Maybe they've realized that wasn't a sustainable business model, especially as human mobility has increased so much, especially for those who have resources. So if you're already limiting to a great extent the people who have access, and then those people then start leaving, choosing to go elsewhere, or I've actually also seen just people lean more towards the American international schools, which makes sense because proximity, the likelihood of their child going to the US or Canada is a lot more than sending them to Europe. But so with all that, I don't know for sure why the enrollment has become a lot more broad, but it's been good to see, and that you also see that reflected in like the diversity of the student body as well. All right. Now, the other thing I would say when thinking about choosing a school, or just kind of helping to make sure that your child has as many options as possible, is just that, like, even though my children were in a French school, I knew they had the Europe option. I knew that they were sort of leaning towards the US option, but I wanted them to also think about other, like you're not even just limited to that, and that's incredible. You can choose a school in Latin America. There are some really great universities. Unfortunately, I feel that locally, a lot of times those schools are not as valued. So if your classmates and the people around you are sort of saying, if I have the choice, I'm going abroad, then I think the likelihood of you wanting to look at those schools diminishes. But it's a shame. And I think there are some wonderful schools in Latin America to choose from. So I wanted them to know that they had those options. And it was just, again, a question of, what are you leaning towards in terms of your career, and where do you think that you would have, the most the better experience. I do recognize, especially in talking to my kids, of why they were leaning towards the U.S. I think the U.S. university or college culture is marketed a lot, so you don't see that as much for any other country. I try to think of any other country that has movies and shows and all these things are just around university culture. I think the culture is unique. I think the university experience is unique. I think it makes sense. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't have an enriching experience in another place. It's just, yeah, when you're bombarded with those ideas, I totally understand why a student or a young person would be enamored and say, that's where I want to go to school. I also recommend for people wanting to relocate, especially abroad or expatriate or immigrate, is to, if possible, keep residency in a state. I think that could be helpful. Now, it doesn't guarantee that your child will want to go to university in that state. And the reason I recommend that is for in-state tuition costs are incredibly lower than out-of-state tuition costs for public schools. Private schools, they're the same across the board, where no matter what state you have residency in, but that was something that was advantageous to us for where my daughter chose to go to school. But again, I don't know yet for my son where he'll end up, and it may not be in the state where we hold residency. But again, we know we have that, and of course he'll apply to schools within that state. And that will, we'll have to weigh when he gets his acceptance letter, is like, what is the best option? But again, it is such a huge difference being able to pay in-state tuition. So if again, and I know it can be difficult, but it's not just for school purposes. I would recommend that to any family. When you expect, I would say like the first 10 years, for a lot of reasons, for voting, for even for remote job opportunities. Sometimes they do, even if you're able to work from wherever, they would like you to have residency somewhere in the US. So it's not hard to maintain for certain states. I'm sure for states like California or Massachusetts, states with a lot of state social programs, they tend to make it harder to establish and then maintain your residency. But states where it's not as hard, where you could have a PO box. It's worth it. Obviously, you want to pick one too that makes sense. You don't want to pick a state that you would never step foot in, but if it's easy to keep the residency in the state you're moving from. If you're moving from the U.S., then even better. Also, I don't think it's important in terms of curriculum, which I know is sometimes a concern. I've even seen with families who choose the American accredited or U.S. accredited international schools here, where they're concerned because they're familiar with the U.S. curriculum, and especially for competitive, or for kids trying to get into competitive universities, like the AP courses and all of that. And if your school doesn't offer it, then there may be this worry of like, will my child have the same chances? There is a thing, and I can't speak to every single university, but I know the majority of them have it. They usually have different quotas for international students, so that helps. It helps to an extent. If you're trying to get into a like a STEM, very competitive program, you're going to be up against international students that are, probably accessing those AP courses and all those things too. But it does, and I've even heard this for students going to the French system, that you're at an advantage to apply as an international student, even if you have the French back. So here, for instance, the education laws require that even for international schools, you still have to do the national program or get the national, which like a back, it's high school diploma, which is actually a good thing. And that's what helps those students have that flexibility. to apply as an international and be in competition that way versus in competition with the rest of the French students, like nationally. That could be difficult, especially if you're trying to get into a competitive program. All that said, just to kind of briefly say what is required if your child is coming from a school that has a different grading system, like the French education system, then you will have to have the grades translated. I can say from experience that French grading system is a lot more rigorous. So it's rare that children or students are getting like 100% on anything, and they take that into account. So it's beneficial. Granted, I mean, I don't know. I guess it depends on the student, but you hit that A ceiling or the 4.0 much lower. Their grades are out of 20 than you would. I would say if you had if you were coming from an A, B, C, D, F grading system. And so, yes, that's an interesting process because getting those grades translated is not as easy as, you sending off your kid's transcript. It actually has to come directly from the school with the school stamp, sealed and everything, straight to the agency and there's a few, usually on the university websites, they'll tell you the accepted, they call them like accreditation bodies, but basically they just translate grades, and there aren't actually, I can't say that there are a bunch of them, but there are a few that you'll probably see the names very frequently. But again, that's the process. You have to have those grades sent directly to that agency from your school, from the child's school. And then, of course, if it's in a different language, then your child also has to take the TOEFL, which is pretty, in comparison to the SATs, I would say that if your child is fluent in English and can read and write in English, then it shouldn't be a problem for them to get a passing grade. Now the SATs, same thing. It's there are testing sites. Obviously you're not going to have the same options or the frequency of testing that you would have in the US, but it's available. You don't have to fly to the US or travel to the US to take the SATs. And then I would say, okay, back to the grades being translated. So they do, the translation is twofold. It's not just translating the grades, it's also translating the courses that were taken, and even the comments. What I found odd with my daughter, and I don't know if this has changed, is that what gets sent in terms of your official transcripts to the university you're applying to, you don't get to see that. You just kind of get to see a summary. I don't know. There must be some like security or some reason that they prefer to do it that way, but I would have liked to see all of the details, but we didn't. And then, so that's the first part of it. But once you get an acceptance or you get an offer or acceptance, and then you confirm that acceptance, then once you obtain your diploma, so in this case the French bac, or if you're doing the IB, you also have to send that official transcript for the diploma to the same agency, and then they will submit that. And so similar process. It's just you have to do it twice. And it's just, in the US you do it too. It's just that you don't have to get it translated. Your high school does that directly for you, and it's done. But that's pretty much it. And of course, all these things have costs. So it is something to think about. But when you, at least for me, when you think of the costs of going to university in the US, it's not, it's already expensive, I guess is what I'm going to say. I would say between the SATs, depending on how many times your child takes it, and the translation of the grades, and the TOEFL, anywhere between, let's say, $650 to $1,000. And I'm speaking from Ecuador, so I can't speak to Peru or Mexico or, somewhere else. But yeah, it is an added expense that you have to consider. But if your child is already in a private school and is not in a local school, then it's probably not that huge of a shock. Now, if you choose a public school, a local public school for them, then from what I understand, where most public schools in Latin America are actually free, then of course, that's a cost that doesn't quite align with what you're accustomed to paying. But people do it, and I know of Ecuadorian families that their children are in public schools as well, but who are very ambitious and who go for scholarships, etc., that have been able to take that route. So again, it's just things to consider when you're first of all looking at primary and secondary education. I've also seen people do primary in the local system just so the child gets the full immersion, and then once they get to secondary, which can range between middle school, high school, or just straight high school, then they look at the private options. And again, it's going to depend on the school and what their enrollment is like. Most private schools that I've seen, they do prefer, that's why they have primary through secondary. They prefer that their students start from the beginning, especially if there's a foreign language component. But there are a lot of options and many ways to kind of work around the system. You just have to, again, do your research. So that is it for this episode. Feel free to leave any questions or other suggestions if I missed anything. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, be well.